Shalom. I hope you're managing to endure the heat and getting on with things as well as you can, as we are. Today we are in chapter 9 of the Besorah of Yochanan, and the first subject, the first narrative, is the man who was blind from birth. Yochanan continues from the previous chapter, which ended with Yeshua passing by those who wanted to stone him for blasphemy, for those who believe that Yeshua never said that he was in fact God. Obviously, the people who heard him believed that he did say that. So Yeshua, neither shaken nor frightened by his confrontation with the religious leaders, we see him calm, self-possessed, in control, despite the presence of those who misjudged and even hated him. He had a profound disregard for his enemies and their slander, and he never allowed their attacks to provoke him as we might be provoked. A blind man sat begging, proclaiming to passers-by the details of his unfortunate birth and life of blindness. Yeshua's Talmudim questioned Yeshua about whose fault it was that this man was born blind. No one seemed to demonstrate any real concern for the man himself, but wanted to allocate blame for the cause of his blindness, a sort of theological assessment. Did he deserve to be blind? It was widely held that suffering was due to sin, and of course, there are people today who believe that as well. As Rav Ami declared, there is no death without sin, and there is no suffering without iniquity. This, of course, is refuted in the Talmud itself, in Shabbat 55a and b. Yeshua was completely disinterested in assigning blame for the man's ailment. As always, he was concerned about the person. This is practical faith, not theologizing or putting forth arguments, but performing acts of mercy, compassion, and kindness. That is his example for us. Do the righteous suffer? What is the cause of suffering? Various ideas existed at that time on the subject, and of course there are many today. Some believed in the pre-existence of souls and the possibility that these pre-existent souls could sin. Others believed in a kind of reincarnation, as some Hasidic groups do today. Perhaps the man sinned in a previous life. Some believed that a baby could sin in the womb, or that punishment could be for a sin the man would later commit. Yeshua declared, very significantly, neither this man nor his parents sinned. Suffering and death, the human condition in general, is the state of all humanity since the sin of Adam and Chava, resulting from this evil inclination which we all share. I'm not going to go further into the subject. There's so much that could be said, but the fact is that when we look at suffering and death, it is the consequence of the evil inclination. And the whole issue really is around the idea of free will, because if we do not have the freedom to do evil, that is, if we don't have any inclination to do evil, just as we also have an inclination to do good, if we didn't have that, then we would be robots or puppets, simply loving God, doing good, because we had no choice. So, further on the subject of this particular man, it is not that God caused the blindness, but God can use circumstances to reveal his power and his mercy. God can reveal his power and mercy in our lives in many ways, including endurance in the face of difficulty, even suffering which we do not understand and which God does not cause, can be used by Hashem for a good purpose. We read in Romans 8:28, we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called in accordance with his purpose. In Matthew 5:45, we're told that rain falls on the just and the unjust. In the same way, illness, trials, and death are the lot of all humanity. And we undoubtedly know people who are righteous people who love God and follow God, who have had struggles in life and who've had suffering. But Yeshua does not focus on a theological issue. He looks at the suffering individual in front of him, because this is an opportunity to display the work of God, with Yeshua as the chief worker. Opportunities for service and for doing good are not unlimited. Yeshua knew the religious leaders wanted to silence and even kill him. But here we observe the extent of his compassion for this one man. In a most unusual way, and not working to a formula, Yeshua emphasized two things. He demonstrates God's compassion by touching the blind man. The weight and feel of the clay would indicate that something was being done for him. He could feel that. And interestingly, spittle, and especially the spittle of some distinguished person, was believed to possess certain curative qualities. Saliva, in the case of disorders of the eye, was well known as a cure in antiquity. Mark recorded two other healings performed by Yeshua with the use of his saliva, in Mark 7:33 and 8:23, using something that people could identify with. The blind man, however, had to take action in order to be healed. He had to go and wash in the pool of Siloam, identified by archaeologists as a mikveh. water for the pool of Siloam came through Hezekiah's tunnel, a remarkable engineering feat. Siloam meant sent because the water had been sent through the conduit into the city. It was from this pool that water was drawn and poured over the great altar at Sukkot, regarded by the rabbis as typical of the pouring out of the Ruach in the latter days. Having faith, the man did as Yeshua said, finding his way to the pool and down the steps into the mikveh itself. According to the scriptures, this is the first time a person who was born blind was healed. Tehillim declares that God opens the eyes of the blind. Tehillim 146, verse 8. And Yeshayahu 35:5 tells us that opening the eyes of the blind will be a manifestation of Mashiach. Immediately, controversy arose concerning this healing. Those who had previously known the man and had seen that he was clearly blind asked him, "How were your eyes opened?" And he told them all the details, including the name of the one who had healed him. Could this really be him? Those who had known him from birth asked if it was indeed possible that someone who was born blind could be cured. Apparently, the man who had been healed knew very little except the name of the one who had healed him. And so he was brought to the Proshim. Why? Surely he should have been taken to the temple to be questioned by the Kohanim. But he was brought to them and questioned about what happened to him. Again, it had taken place on Shabbat. Since the blind man did not approach Yeshua, we must assume that Yeshua chose to heal this man, and he chose Shabbat on which to do it. The man had been blind from birth. He would have been blind on Sunday too. Yeshua chose this day. And it's interesting to note, along with the many commandments that we know today the Orthodox have created, one of the types of work specifically forbidden by tradition on Shabbat was something called kneading. Kneading, being the act that one used for making bread. And the reason it was forbidden was to lighten the load of most women who were expected to bake bread every day. The Proshim decided that Yeshua's act of taking saliva and clay and mixing them together fell into this category. How absurd is that? But no act of necessity or mercy would be forbidden on Shabbat by our merciful God, as stated in the 13 attributes of divine mercy, Shemot 34, 6-7. Because of this, because he had again healed on Shabbat in a way that they found objectionable, some Proshim said Yeshua could not be from God because he failed to act as they expected and in accordance with their traditions and their teachings. Some accepted Yeshua, believing that perhaps their interpretation of Shabbat law was incorrect. This group was obviously in the minority, as events proved, and they are not mentioned again. If they continued to believe as they did, they didn't say anything. Those who saw and heard were divided about Yeshua. Some did believe he was Mashiach, and others did not. The question that hung in the air was, how can a sinner, how can someone who is not righteous do such miraculous signs? At that point, they turned to the man who'd been healed and asked for his opinion of Yeshua. How absurd is that? The religious leaders had already made up their minds regarding Yeshua, but because of the minority opinion in his favor, they were at a loss, asking someone they would never have considered questioning normally. He is a prophet. Prophets were viewed as miracle workers, and some of them, like Eliyahu, certainly were. According to some Jewish traditions, a prophet might even break Shabbat laws and be guiltless. But rather than believe him, the religious leaders chose to believe this man, had not been born blind. Simple solution. He wasn't really blind. They even questioned his parents. His parents verified that yes, this is their son and he was born blind. But they could not say how he was healed. They knew it had been agreed that if anyone said Yeshua was Mashiach, that person would be put out of the synagogue, as in chapter 12, verse 42. Harem, Nesafah, these were rabbinic designations of excommunication. It was a very serious threat. The parents were frightened, so they told these religious authorities to ask their son. After all, he was of age. The religious leaders command the blind man to be honest. Obviously, he's not telling the full truth. They say, give God the glory, meaning tell us the truth. And we know this man is a sinner. You've been holding back the truth, lying to us. The simple testimony of the man born blind is, although I was blind, now I see. This is an irrefutable argument. But the religious leaders bombarded the man with questions, using harsh words and intensity, what we would call the third degree, to force him to say what they wanted to hear. But he says, I told you already, and you're unwilling to listen. If they continued to ask the same question, they would receive the same response. Unexpectedly, this seemingly simple man responds to them with irony, which mocks their prejudice against Yeshua. He asks, sarcastically, do you also want to become his Talmudim? Is that why you're questioning me? Despite his honesty in answering their questions, these religious leaders reviled him for his answers, for telling the truth, saying, you are his Talmid, but we are Moshe's Talmidim. They're saying to him, God spoke through Moshe, who is our rabbi, but we don't know where this fellow Yeshua comes from. The man's response, you, our religious experts, observe what he does, and yet you can't figure out where he's from? Observant Jews believed that a miracle in answer to prayer is proof that the worker is not a sinner. Yeshayahu 1:15, Tehillim 66:18. Although this is not necessarily true, considering God's great mercy, it was what was believed. Their final response to the man born blind, a man they clearly looked down upon, was particularly vindictive because they knew he was right. So they excommunicated him, meaning that he had no further rights in the temple or any synagogue for any purpose. That would mean things like burial. It was a shocking thing to do. Yeshua heard that the man he had healed had been excommunicated by the religious leaders, so he went and found him. The religious leaders rejected this man, but Yeshua, who had already met his most desperate physical need, still sought him out to address his most pressing spiritual need. As he so often did, Yeshua went straight to the point, the real issue. He asked him pointedly, do you believe in the Son of God? This is not an esoteric or philosophical question. He is asking, do you believe that I am the Son of God? While the religious leaders had expelled the man from their places of worship from contact with God even, he publicly worshipped Yeshua. When Yeshua received his worship, it was proof that he is God, because only God may be worshipped. Yeshua reiterates this repeatedly throughout his ministry. And yet, Yeshua accepts worship as God, knowing himself to be God. We observe in the man born blind a growing awareness of the truth about Yeshua. Yeshua is a prophet. Yeshua is a rabbi. Yeshua is from Hashem. Yeshua is the Son of God. Yeshua is the one in whom he trusts. Yeshua is worshipped. Those who are spiritually blind and those who see. Yeshua is the pivot upon which human destiny turns. The division over Yeshua, which began in the early days of his ministry, continues to this day. Yeshua states that he came for judgment. He is the dividing line. We are told that recognition or rejection of him is the basis of our judgment by God. That those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind. Yeshua is saying, in a spiritually metaphorical sense, that all who are spiritually blind are unable to see God's truth. Those who recognize their spiritual blindness can receive sight through Yeshua. Those who wrongly claim to have spiritual sight suppose they see, but they are truly blind. And in the case of the Parshim, the blind leading the blind. The Parshim sarcastically and arrogantly ask Yeshua if he considers them to be blind also. If they would admit their own spiritual blindness, healing would be possible and they could be forgiven. But instead, they simply shut their eyes to the truth. The light exists, but people refuse to allow it to expose the true state of affairs. They continue to deliberately reject the enlightenment offered by God. I wish you a blessed week, and I look forward to seeing you soon.